A hardened Chicago cop hires a black caregiver for his 7-year-old autistic daughter. But the hidden cameras he installs are about to expose more than he bargained for. Lieutenant Mike Donovan was a man forged in the unforgiving streets of Chicago, a cop who faced down hardened criminals and never backed down from a fight. But nothing in his 42 years, not the academy, not a decade on the force, had prepared him for the crushing silence and the overwhelming challenges that had enveloped his own home after his wife's sudden death. His only daughter, Lily, was diagnosed with Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD, shortly after the tragedy, a condition compounded by severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, from witnessing the accident that took her mother. Lily had retreated into a world of her own, her vibrant chatter replaced by an unnerving quiet, her easy laughter a forgotten echo. Social interactions became fraught with anxiety, her routines rigid, and meltdowns frequent and overwhelming. Therapists came and went, their expensive methods and carefully structured programs failing to penetrate the complex layers of her grief and her autism until she arrived. Sarah Johnson, a 35-year-old African-American woman with no advanced degrees in child psychology, no formal therapy credentials, just a quiet confidence and a history of working with children with diverse needs at a small community center. Mike hired her out of sheer gut-wrenching desperation, but a cop's instinct told him something was different. Then Lily, his precious, struggling Lily, began to show a flicker of her old self, a hesitant smile, tiny, almost imperceptible shifts in her engagement with the world that no one else had managed. And Mike Donovan, a man trained to observe, to control, to trust no one implicitly, had his modest Chicago bungalow wired. Discreet cameras, hidden in plain sight, to understand what was truly happening when he wasn't looking. What those lenses would reveal wouldn't just change how he saw his daughter's caregiver, or even his daughter. It would force him to confront the complexities of healing and bring a decorated police lieutenant to his knees. Lieutenant Mike Donovan had built his career on gut instinct and a rigid adherence to the rules. He navigated the complex, often brutal landscape of Chicago law enforcement with a reputation for being tough but fair. People in his precinct respected him. Criminals feared him. But within the unassuming brick walls of his South Side home, there was one battle he was unequivocally losing. The battle to reach his daughter, to ease the profound distress that autism spectrum disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder had wrought upon her young life. Lily was 7. The vibrant, chatty little girl he remembered had vanished the day her mother, Emily, was killed in a senseless hit-and-run 2 years prior. Lily had been in the car. After the funeral, the changes were stark and heartbreaking. Eye contact became a rarity. Spoken words dwindled to near non-existence outside of immediate, urgent needs, often expressed through frustration. Her world shrank, governed by anxieties and sensory sensitivities that Mike struggled to comprehend. 2:45. She would spend hours in her room, meticulously arranging her toys in specific patterns, rocking gently if overwhelmed, her small hands sometimes flapping when distress took hold. Any sudden loud noise, a slammed door, a siren in the distance, a sound Mike brought home with him every day, could trigger a meltdown, a terrifying vortex of screams and tears that left both Lily and Mike exhausted and adrift. Doctors confirmed the autism spectrum disorder, explaining how the trauma had likely exacerbated her existing neurological differences, leading to the severe regression and the crippling symptoms of PTSD. Mike, who could solve million-dollar city problems, or so it felt on some days, with a few decisive actions, stood utterly powerless before the invisible torment his daughter endured. He'd consulted the best pediatric neurologists and developmental pediatricians the city had to offer, enrolled Lily in specialized occupational and speech therapy programs, even converted a room into a sensory-friendly space filled with weighted blankets, calming lights, and tactile toys. The medical bills piled up, a testament to his desperate efforts. Nothing seemed to make a significant dent, until Sarah Johnson. She wasn't from a prestigious agency. Her resume was a single page, detailing her work at a neighborhood community center on the West Side, helping children with a wide range of developmental and emotional challenges, kids who had seen too much too soon. Her references were from everyday parents, not renowned doctors, speaking of her patience, her quiet way of connecting, her intuitive understanding. She had a warm, steady gaze and a calm demeanor that seemed almost out of place in Mike's perpetually stressed existence. Mike hadn't wanted to interview her. It was Frank, his old colleague, who had pushed him, swearing Sarah had a gift. "Just give her a week, Mike," Frank had urged. "1 week. No pressure, no expectations. Just let her be with Lily. See if she can connect where others haven't." Mike had relented, more from a bone-deep weariness than any real flicker of hope. The first time Sarah Johnson stepped into the Donovan house, she didn't carry a briefcase full of therapy tools or assessment charts. She had a simple tote bag with a few well-loved picture books, some soft clay, and what looked like some fabric scraps of different textures. She greeted Mike with a polite nod, her voice gentle but firm. "Lieutenant Donovan," she'd said, "I'm not here to fix Lily. I'm here to understand her world, and hopefully help her feel safe enough to share a little of it." That phrase, "understand her world," stuck with Mike. Lily, predictably, showed little outward reaction to Sarah that first day, or the second. She remained mostly non-verbal, avoiding eye contact, engaging in her repetitive behaviors. Sarah didn't force interaction. Mike watched on the newly installed cameras, tiny lenses hidden in smoke detectors, bookshelves, even a stuffed animal in Lily's room. He saw Sarah sit quietly on the floor near Lily, sometimes humming softly, sometimes just being a calm, unobtrusive presence. She'd gently roll a textured ball in Lily's direction, or offer a piece of soft fabric, placing it nearby without expectation. No overt response from Lily. But Sarah kept trying, her patience seemingly infinite. By the 4th day, Mike, compulsively checking the camera feeds on his phone during a lull at the precinct, saw something that made him lean closer to the screen, his breath catching. Sarah was sitting on the floor, a small, shallow tray of sand in front of her. Lily was a few feet away, her back mostly to Sarah, but her head was angled slightly, her peripheral vision clearly on Sarah's activity. Sarah wasn't looking at Lily. She was simply running her fingers through the sand, letting it trickle, making soft patterns. She did this for almost 10 minutes, a quiet, repetitive, rhythmic action. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lily shifted. She didn't turn fully, but her small hand reached out, her fingers twitching, hovering just above her own patch of carpet. Mike held his breath. It was the smallest of gestures, but for Lily, it was monumental. It was an indication of interest, a tentative step out of her locked-down world. He rewound the footage, watched it again. It was real, a minuscule crack in the wall of silence and anxiety. And in that moment, something inside Mike Donovan, the hardened cop, the grieving widower, the desperate father, began to shift. The cameras he'd installed out of suspicion were now showing him a flicker of something he'd almost forgotten: hope. But with that hope came a new, unsettling question. Who exactly was this woman, Sarah Johnson, and what was she really doing to reach his daughter? Sarah Johnson settled into the Donovan household with a quiet efficiency that was both unnerving and, Mike had to admit, somewhat calming. She didn't try to fill the silence with forced cheerfulness or bombard Lily with questions. Instead, she moved through the house like a gentle tide, her presence a soft counterpoint to the sharp edges of Mike's grief and Lily's locked-in world. Mike, true to his nature, became an obsessive observer. The camera feeds were his constant companions, on his phone during breaks at the precinct, on his laptop late at night after Lily was asleep. He was looking for, he wasn't entirely sure what. A sign that Sarah was untrustworthy? Proof that this was another dead end? Or perhaps a sliver of evidence that Frank's recommendation hadn't been entirely misguided? What he saw was perplexing. Sarah's interactions with Lily were unlike anything the previous therapists had attempted. There were no structured lessons, no reward charts, no direct demands for Lily to speak or perform. Instead, Sarah created an environment. She'd often sit on the floor in Lily's room, not too close, and engage in her own quiet activities. Sometimes she'd sketch in a notepad, humming softly. Other times, she'd meticulously sort colorful beads into small bowls, the gentle clinking sound a soft rhythm in the otherwise silent room. Lily, initially, showed no outward acknowledgement of Sarah's presence. She'd continue her own routines, lining up her few remaining toy cars, staring out the window, or rocking almost imperceptibly. But Mike, a trained observer, noticed the subtle shifts. Lily's rocking would sometimes, just sometimes, seem to unconsciously match the rhythm of Sarah's humming. Her eyes, usually fixed on some distant point, would occasionally flick towards Sarah's hands as she worked with the beads, a fleeting curiosity. One afternoon, Mike watched a particularly puzzling sequence. Sarah had brought in a small, shallow wooden box filled with smooth grey stones of varying sizes. She sat on the floor, carefully arranging the stones into intricate, almost mandala-like patterns. She did this for nearly half an hour, her focus absolute, occasionally whispering something too low for the camera's microphone to pick up clearly. Lily from across the room watched her intently, her usual vacant stare replaced by a focused intensity Mike hadn't seen in months. Then, Sarah carefully dismantled the pattern, placed the stones back in the box, and left the room without a word to Lily. Mike frowned at the screen. What was that? Some kind of New Age ritual. It seemed pointless, almost bizarre. His cop brain, trained to look for motive and meaning, struggled to categorize it. Was this part of some unconventional therapy, or was it just strange? The ambiguity gnawed at him. A few days later, another incident caught his attention. He saw Sarah sitting with Lily, a children's picture book open between them. Lily, as usual, wasn't looking at the book. Sarah wasn't reading aloud in the traditional sense. Instead, she was tracing the illustrations with her finger, her lips moving silently, as if narrating the story only to herself. After a while, she gently took Lily's small, unresisting hand and guided Lily's own finger over the pictures, a slow, deliberate movement. Lily didn't pull away. She didn't look at the book either, but her hand remained under Sarah's, following the tracing motion. Mike felt a confusing mix of emotions. There was an undeniable pull, a sense that something was happening, something beyond his understanding. Lily wasn't cured. Not by a long shot. But these were interactions, however faint, however unconventional. Yet, the strangeness of Sarah's methods, her almost mystical calm, kept his suspicion alive. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, that there was more to Sarah Johnson than met the eye. His need for control, for concrete answers, warred with the undeniable, albeit tiny flickers of light he was witnessing through the cold, impartial lens of his hidden cameras. Just as Mike was beginning to allow a fragile tendril of hope to unfurl, Susan arrived. Emily's older sister, Susan, had always maintained a polite, if somewhat strained relationship with Mike, especially after Emily's death. She was an opinionated woman, quick to judge, and possessed a particular talent for planting seeds of doubt with a well-aimed comment. She'd called to say she was just in the neighborhood and wanted to drop off some of Emily's old photo albums she'd found. Mike knew it was more than that. Susan had a way of checking in that felt more like an inspection. When Susan saw Sarah interacting with Lily, Sarah was quietly building a tower of soft blocks while Lily sat nearby, occasionally reaching out a tentative finger to touch one, her perfectly plucked eyebrows arched. "So, this is the new helper?" Susan asked later, when Lily was napping and she and Mike were having a stilted cup of coffee in the kitchen. Her tone was neutral, but the implication was clear. "Sarah Johnson." "Yes," Mike replied, trying to keep his own voice even. "Frank recommended her. She's been good with Lily." "Good, how?" Susan pressed, stirring her coffee with unnecessary vigor. "Is Lily talking yet? Is she back to her old self?" Mike sighed. "It's not that simple, Susan. You know that. But there have been small changes. She seems a little calmer." Susan took a sip of her coffee, her eyes shrewd. "I just hope you've checked her out thoroughly, Michael. You know, with Lily's condition, you can't be too careful. I heard some things, through the grapevine." Mike's internal alarm bells, never truly silent when it came to Sarah, began to clang louder. "What kind of things?" "Oh, just whispers," Susan said vaguely, waving a dismissive hand. "Something about her leaving her last position at that community center rather abruptly. Some sort of incident they tried to keep quiet. Probably nothing, but with a child as vulnerable as Lily." She let the sentence hang, the insinuation potent. The seed was planted. Mike, despite himself, felt it take root. Susan's words, combined with his own lingering unease about Sarah's unconventional methods and the muddled aspects of her resume he'd noticed, details like a gap in employment she hadn't fully explained, a previous address that seemed to lead to a vacant lot when he'd discreetly run a check, started to form a troubling picture. That evening, driven by Susan's insinuations and his own resurfacing suspicions, Mike did something he knew crossed a line, even for him. He accessed restricted police databases, using his credentials to run a more in-depth, unofficial background check on Sarah Johnson. Most of it came back clean, minor traffic violations, nothing criminal. But then he found it. A sealed juvenile record from when Sarah was 16. The details were expunged, inaccessible even to him without a warrant. But the mere existence of a sealed juvenile record, something Sarah had definitely not disclosed, felt like a betrayal, a confirmation of his deepest fears. What was she hiding, and why? The flickers of light he'd seen through the camera lens were now overshadowed by a growing, ominous cloud of doubt. Susan's whispers, combined with this new, unsettling discovery, made Mike question everything he thought he was beginning to see in Sarah, and more terrifyingly, everything he was entrusting her with when it came to his precious, silent daughter. The discovery of Sarah's sealed juvenile record, coupled with Susan's insinuations, cast a long shadow over Mike's perception. Every action Sarah took, every quiet interaction with Lily, was now filtered through a lens of suspicion. The camera feeds, once a source of cautious hope, became a tool for intense, almost paranoid scrutiny. He started noticing things he hadn't before, or perhaps things he now interpreted differently. Sarah often spent time in Lily's room after Lily had fallen asleep, sometimes just sitting quietly in the dim light, other times tidying up with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. Was it care, or was she searching for something? Her quiet humming, once soothing, now sometimes sounded like a strange incantation to his overactive imagination. The mumbo-jumbo with the stones, the silent storytelling. Were these really innovative techniques, or something more unsettling? His cop's mind, trained to look for deception, started working overtime, constructing narratives that painted Sarah in an increasingly dubious light. Lily, sensitive to the subtle shifts in atmosphere, seemed to pick up on Mike's growing tension, though he tried to hide it. There were a couple of days where her progress seemed to stall, her brief moments of engagement receding, replaced by a familiar wariness. Mike, in his anxiety, internally blamed Sarah, wondering if her methods were somehow destabilizing his daughter. One night, unable to sleep, Mike was reviewing the day's camera footage. It was late, well past midnight. The house was dark and silent. He watched as Sarah, dressed in a simple t-shirt and pajama pants, emerged silently from her small guest room. This in itself wasn't unusual. She sometimes got a glass of water. But then, instead of heading to the kitchen, she moved stealthily towards his closed office door. Mike's office was his sanctuary, the one place in the house that still felt entirely his, filled with Emily's photographs, her favorite books, and files from his most important cases. He'd made it clear, politely but firmly, that it was off limits. He watched, his heart pounding, as Sarah gently tried the doorknob. It was locked. She paused then, to Mike's utter shock. He saw her reach into her pocket and pull out something small and metallic. A hairpin? A lockpick? The camera angle wasn't clear enough. But after a moment of almost imperceptible fiddling, the lock clicked open. Sarah slipped inside his office, closing the door softly behind her. Mike stared at the screen, a cold fury mixing with a sickening sense of betrayal. What in God's name was she doing? Was she a thief? A spy? Was this whole gentle caregiver act a sophisticated con? He fast-forwarded the footage, his hand shaking. Sarah was in his office for nearly 10 minutes. The cameras inside his office, he'd installed one there too, a last-minute addition, showed her moving around, her back mostly to the lens. She paused for a long time in front of his desk, where a framed photo of him and Emily sat. Then she appeared to take something small from the top drawer of his desk, something flat, rectangular, indistinguishable on the grainy footage, before slipping it into her pocket and exiting the office as silently as she had entered, carefully relocking the door. Mike felt the blood drain from his face. The trust he had tentatively, cautiously begun to build had just been obliterated. This wasn't just strange methods anymore. This was a direct violation, a trespass, and potentially a theft. The shadows in his house had just taken on a much more sinister form. The image of Sarah Johnson in his locked office, taking something from his desk, burned itself into Mike's mind. Sleep was impossible. He replayed the footage over and over, each viewing confirming his worst fears. The woman he had reluctantly entrusted with his fragile daughter was, it seemed, a deceiver, a trespasser, perhaps even a thief. The sealed juvenile record, Susan's warnings, Sarah's odd behaviors, it all coalesced into a damning narrative. He waited until morning, a storm of anger and betrayal raging within him. He needed to confront her, but he also needed to be strategic, to see what she would say, how she would react. He was a cop, after all. Interrogation was his specialty. When Sarah emerged from her room, her usual calm demeanor seemed, to Mike's now hyper-suspicious eyes, like a carefully constructed mask. He waited until Lily was occupied with her breakfast, a small bowl of oatmeal Sarah had prepared, which Lily was actually, to Mike's distant astonishment, eating without protest. "Sarah," Mike began, his voice dangerously low. "We need to talk, in my office." Sarah looked at him, a flicker of something. Surprise? Apprehension? In her eyes. But she simply nodded. "Of course, Lieutenant." In his office, Mike closed the door, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He didn't offer her a seat. He stood behind his desk, his stance confrontational. "Last night," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "you were in this room. You picked the lock. You went through my desk. What were you looking for, Sarah? And what did you take?" Sarah's composure didn't waver, though a slight flush rose on her cheeks. "Lieutenant Donovan, I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can," Mike sneered, his anger starting to break through. "That's what people usually say when they're caught red-handed. So explain. Explain why my daughter's caregiver is breaking into my private office in the middle of the night." "I wasn't breaking in," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but firm. "And I didn't take anything that wasn't meant for Lily. Yesterday afternoon, Lily. She doesn't use many words, as you know, but she communicates. She kept pointing towards your office, making a small, repetitive gesture towards your desk. She seemed distressed. I couldn't understand what she wanted, and she was becoming more agitated." Mike stared at her, incredulous. Lily pointed. "Lily, who barely acknowledges anyone, suddenly gave you directions to my locked office and my desk." "It wasn't like that," Sarah explained patiently. "It was subtle, but I've learned to read her cues. I believed she was trying to tell me something was in here that she needed or that was upsetting her. I tried the door, it was locked. I admit I used a hairpin to open it. That was wrong, and I apologize. I was concerned for Lily." "A hairpin," Mike repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. How resourceful. "And what, pray tell, was this precious item Lily so desperately needed from my desk drawer?" Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, faded, silver-toned object. It was a child's barrette, shaped like a butterfly, a little tarnished with age. Mike's breath caught. It had belonged to Emily. She'd often worn it in Lily's hair when Lily was a toddler. He hadn't seen it in years, had assumed it was lost. "This was in the top drawer," Sarah said softly. "Lily used to wear it, didn't she? I think seeing the photograph of your wife on your desk, perhaps it reminded her. She became very calm after I showed it to her this morning, before she came out for breakfast. She even touched it." Twist number 5. Mike was momentarily stunned. The explanation, however improbable it seemed that Lily could have communicated such a specific need, had a sliver of plausibility, especially given Lily's recent, tiny improvements. But his suspicion, fueled by days of doubt and the damning video, was a powerful force. "So, you expect me to believe that my selectively mute, autistic daughter, who barely interacts with the world, somehow telepathically guided you to a specific forgotten hair clip in my locked office?" He shook his head. "That's quite a story, Sarah, but it doesn't explain your sealed juvenile record, does it? Or the incident at the community center your previous employer was so keen to keep quiet about." Sarah's face, which had softened slightly when talking about the barrette, now hardened again. "My past is my past, Lieutenant. It has no bearing on my ability to care for Lily. The incident was a misunderstanding, a gross mischaracterization of events where I was trying to protect a child, and what was sealed for a reason when I was a minor, and it involved defending myself. None of it makes me a threat to your daughter." Her explanation, while direct, felt evasive to Mike in his current state. He saw a pattern of secrecy, of things undisclosed. The Barrett could be a lucky guess, a clever manipulation. His cop instincts, now fully engaged and suspicious, overshadowed any lingering hope. He saw a woman with a hidden past, a knack for picking locks, and a story that to him sounded too convenient. The confrontation, instead of clearing the air, had only deepened the chasm of his mistrust. Mike's demand that Sarah stay out of his office and his subsequent cooler demeanor created a palpable tension in the house. Lily, with the heightened sensitivity often characteristic of children on the autism spectrum, picked up on it immediately. The small, tentative bridges of connection she had begun to build with Sarah started to show cracks. She became more withdrawn again, her fleeting moments of eye contact diminishing. The humming Sarah had coaxed from her faded. Mealtimes, which had seen slight improvements with Lily occasionally touching her food when Sarah was present, reverted to a familiar struggle. Mike watched all this on the cameras, a knot of frustration and a growing, terrible fear tightening in his gut. Was he wrong about Sarah? Or was this regression proof that her influence was, in fact, detrimental? Susan, his sister-in-law, chose this precise moment to reappear, armed with what she claimed was new information. She'd done some digging of her own, she announced with an air of grim satisfaction. "Michael, you need to be very careful," Susan said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper over the phone. "I spoke to someone who knew someone who worked at that community center with Sarah. They said she was always a bit odd, kept to herself. And there were rumors. She was involved in some sort of alternative spiritual practices. Nothing illegal, of course, but strange. They said she used to collect odd objects, arrange them in patterns. Does that sound familiar?" It did. The stones, the almost ritualistic way Sarah sometimes interacted with objects. Mike's mind, already primed for suspicion, latched onto Susan's words. Alternative spiritual practices. What did that even mean? Was Sarah trying to influence Lily in some way he didn't understand, some way that was potentially harmful? That evening, Mike, driven by a new wave of anxiety, decided to discreetly search Sarah's small guest room while she was in the backyard with Lily, though Lily was mostly ignoring her, staring at a ladybug on a leaf. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing he was crossing yet another line, but justified it as a father's desperate need to protect his child. In Sarah's room, tucked away in a drawer beneath some neatly folded clothes, he found a worn leather-bound journal. His heart hammered. This was it, he thought. A window into her true thoughts, her real intentions. He hesitated for only a second before opening it. The pages were filled with Sarah's neat handwriting, but it wasn't a diary of dark secrets or strange rituals. It was observations, detailed, almost clinical notes about Lily. Lily responded to the blue block today, held it for 3 seconds, slight aversion to the sound of the blender, even from 2 rooms away. Hummed 2 notes of the lullaby when she thought no one was listening. There were sketches of Lily's repetitive hand movements, notes on her food preferences, her reactions to different textures, different sounds, different times of day. And then Mike saw it. Interspersed with the observations were what looked like letters. Letters to someone named Daniel. They were filled with a quiet grief, a longing, a mother's unwavering love for a child she had lost. "Daniel, my sweet boy. Lily reminds me so much of you sometimes, her fierce independence, the way she notices the smallest things. I wish you could have met her. I try to give her the patience you always taught me to have." Mike's blood ran cold. Sarah had a child she had lost. Why hadn't she ever mentioned this? This wasn't a strange spiritual practice. This was the profound, hidden grief of a mother. The objects he'd seen her arrange, the quiet humming, were they ways she coped, ways she remembered Daniel, ways she tried to connect with another child who was also lost, in a different way? He felt a wave of shame so intense it was almost physical. He had judged her, suspected her, based on incomplete information, on his own fears, and on the malicious whispers of others. He had seen a potential threat where there was, perhaps, only a woman carrying her own deep sorrow, trying to bring a little light into his daughter's darkness. The fissures weren't just in Lily's silence. They were in his own perception, his own brokenness. The discovery of Sarah's journal, with its heartbreaking entries about her lost son, Daniel, should have been a moment of clarity for Mike. It should have dispelled his suspicions, opened his eyes to the depth of Sarah's empathy. But Mike Donovan, the seasoned cop, the grieving husband, the desperate father, was a man walking a tightrope of conflicting emotions, and Susan's insidious whispers still echoed in his ears. Instead of understanding, a new, more complex suspicion took root. Was Sarah projecting her own loss onto Lily? Was her connection with his daughter not a professional, therapeutic one, but something unhealthier? Was she trying to replace her lost son with Lily? The thought, however irrational, burrowed into his mind, fed by Susan's earlier insinuations about Sarah being odd and secretive. The breaking point came a few days later. Mike was watching the camera feed from his work computer. Sarah and Lily were in the living room. Lily, in a rare moment of initiative, had picked up one of Emily's old, beautifully illustrated poetry book, a book Mike hadn't been able to bring himself to open since Emily's death. Lily wasn't reading, of course, but she was tracing the pictures with her finger, her expression uncharacteristically focused. Sarah sat down beside her, not speaking at first, just observing. Then, very gently, she began to read one of the poems aloud. Her voice soft and melodic. It was a poem Emily had loved, one she used to read to Lily. As Sarah read, Lily leaned almost imperceptibly closer, her small hand reaching out to touch the page where Sarah's finger rested. For an objective observer, it might have been a beautiful, tender moment of connection, but for Mike, watching through the distorted lens of his grief and suspicion, it felt like a transgression. Sarah was in Emily's chair, reading her favorite poem to his daughter, a poem that was sacred, a memory he fiercely guarded. It felt like an intrusion, a replacement. Susan's words, "She's replacing your wife in that child's eyes," which he had dismissed from a different source in a previous story iteration, now screamed in his mind with renewed, twisted validity. He didn't think. He reacted. He stormed home from the precinct, his mind a tempest of irrational anger and possessive grief. He found Sarah and Lily still in the living room, the book of poetry open on Sarah's lap. Lily, startled by his sudden, furious entrance, let out a small, frightened whimper and shrank back. "What do you think you're doing?" Mike's voice was a low, dangerous snarl, directed at Sarah. Sarah looked up, surprised, and then alarmed by the fury in his eyes. "Lieutenant, is something wrong?" "Wrong?" He practically spat the word. "You're in my wife's chair, reading her book to my daughter, acting like you belong here, like you can just step into her life." The words were out before he could stop them, ugly and accusatory. "Mike, I was just," Sarah began, her voice calm but her eyes showing hurt. "I don't want to hear it," he cut her off, his control snapping. He was no longer Lieutenant Donovan, the professional cop. He was just a grieving, angry man lashing out. "You've overstepped, Sarah. You've overstepped in so many ways. I don't trust you. I don't know who you are, with your secrets and your strange ways." Lily began to cry, a high-pitched, keening sound that usually tore Mike apart. But now, in his rage, it barely registered. "I think it's best if you leave," Mike said, the words cold and final. "Now, pack your things and go." Sarah stared at him, her face pale, her earlier composure finally cracking. He saw a flicker of deep pain in her eyes, but also a weary resignation. She didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself further. She simply nodded, stood up, and walked towards her room, the open book of poetry sliding unheeded to the floor. Lily's cries escalated into a full-blown meltdown, a storm of anguish that mirrored the one raging inside Mike. But he was blind to it, deaf to it. He had made his decision, an erroneous edict born of grief, suspicion, and the manipulative whispers of others. He had silenced the one person who seemed to be reaching his daughter, all because he couldn't silence the demons within himself. The silence that descended upon the Donovan house after Sarah left was a different kind of silence than before. It was no longer the quiet, withdrawn world of Lily's autism and PTSD. It was a raw, gaping void, heavy with regret and the piercing screams of his daughter's distress. Lily's regression was swift and brutal. The tentative steps she had taken towards engagement, the fleeting smiles, the soft hums, all vanished as if they had never been. She retreated so far into herself that Mike felt as if he were looking at her through a thick, soundproof wall. Her meltdowns became more frequent, more intense, triggered by the smallest of things. She refused food, thrashed in her sleep, and the rocking, once a subtle, self-soothing mechanism, became a frantic, almost violent motion. Mike tried everything he knew, everything the previous therapist suggested. He spoke to her in low, calm tones. He offered her favorite, formerly favorite, now untouched, toys. He sat with her for hours, just being present, but nothing penetrated the wall. His presence, once a source of some comfort, now often seemed to agitate her further. She would flinch if he tried to touch her, her small body tensing with a fear that tore at his heart. He was alone with her, truly alone, in a way he hadn't been even in the immediate aftermath of Emily's death. Then, there had been the flurry of arrangements, resiliency meaning but ultimately unhelpful sympathy of friends and family. Now, there was just this screaming silence, a constant, agonizing testament to his catastrophic misjudgment. Susan, his sister-in-law, called a few times ostensibly to check in. "I told you that woman was no good, Michael," she said, her voice laced with a self-righteous satisfaction that made Mike's stomach churn. "Lily's probably just reacting to the negative energy Sarah left behind. She'll settle down. You just need to be firm, get her back into a routine." Instead of feeling any vindication from Susan's words, Mike felt a surge of revulsion. Susan's pronouncements, once seeds of doubt, now sounded hollow, malicious even. He saw her interference, her biased whispers, for what they were. Not genuine concern for Lily, but a petty, perhaps even jealous, attempt to exert influence, to undermine his already fragile confidence as a single father. He curtly ended the call, a new, cold anger towards Susan solidifying within him, though it did little to alleviate his guilt over Sarah. Days bled into a week, then two. Mike was exhausted, running on fumes and caffeine, his work at the precinct suffering. His captain, a gruff but understanding man, had noticed. "Donovan, you look like hell. What's going on with your kid?" Mike couldn't bring himself to explain the full extent of his folly. He just mumbled something about Lily having a rough patch. The breaking point came during a particularly violent meltdown. Lily, inconsolable, had thrashed around her room, knocking over a small bookshelf. As Mike tried to calm her, his eyes fell on a small, almost hidden object that had tumbled out from behind the books, the tarnished silver butterfly barret, Emily's barret, the one Sarah had said Lily wanted. He picked it up, his hand trembling. Lily, seeing it, suddenly went still, her sobs quieting to ragged gasps, her eyes, wide and tear-filled, fixed on the barret in his hand. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out a small finger and touched it. In that moment, something in Mike shattered. Sarah had been telling the truth, about the barret, about Lily's subtle communications, and he, in his fear and suspicion, had thrown it all away. He had driven away the one person who had truly seen his daughter, truly connected with her. The weight of his mistake was crushing, a physical burden that made it hard to breathe. The silence in the room wasn't just Lily's anymore, it was the screaming silence of his own profound regret. The sight of Lily's small hand reaching for Emily's barret, the raw, undeniable truth of that simple gesture, was the catalyst Mike needed. The dam of his pride, his fear, his stubborn self-deception, finally broke. That night, after a distraught Lily had finally cried herself to sleep, Mike didn't go to bed. He went to his office, but not to brood. He went to the computer where the camera footage was stored. With a heavy heart and a sense of dread, he began to watch. Not just snippets, not just the suspicious moments, but everything. Hours upon hours of footage from the first day Sarah had walked into their lives. He watched with new eyes, eyes unclouded by Susan's poison or his own ingrained cynicism. He saw Sarah's infinite patience, the way she never pushed, never pressured. He saw her gentle humming, the soft melodies she played on the small keyboard, the quiet, repetitive actions with the stones and sand that had once seemed so bizarre to him. Now he saw them for what they were. Attempts to enter Lily's world on Lily's terms, to create a predictable, soothing rhythm in a life that had been shattered by chaos and trauma. He saw Lily's subtle responses, moments he had dismissed or misinterpreted before. The slight tilt of her head towards Sarah's music, the fleeting seconds of eye contact, the way her small body would relax almost imperceptibly when Sarah was near. He saw Sarah guiding Lily's hand over the picture book, not forcing her to look, but offering a shared, gentle experience. He rewatched the footage of Sarah in his office. This time, he noticed the distress on Lily's face earlier that day, the way her small hand had indeed gestured vaguely towards his office door. He saw Sarah's hesitation before trying the lock, the genuine concern in her expression, and he saw her find the barrette, her face softening with understanding, not malice. The theft he had imagined was a rescue mission, guided by his own daughter. Then he found Emily's journal. He'd avoided it for 2 years, the pain too raw. Now, with trembling fingers, he opened it. Emily's familiar handwriting filled the pages, her thoughts, her dreams, her fears for Lily. She wrote about Lily's unique sensitivities even before the accident, her love for music, her fascination with textures and patterns. She wrote about her hopes that Lily would find someone who truly understood her, someone patient and kind. As Mike read, it was as if Emily herself were speaking to him, describing Sarah Johnson. Twist number 9, the turning point. Just as Mike was rereading a particularly poignant passage in Emily's journal, his phone rang. It was Frank, his old colleague, the one who had recommended Sarah. Frank sounded agitated. "Mike, I just heard some crazy stuff," Frank said, his voice urgent. "Susan, your sister-in-law, she's been spreading some real nasty rumors about Sarah Johnson. Something about Sarah getting fired from the community center under a cloud of suspicion, implying she was a danger to kids." Mike's blood ran cold. "What? That's not what Sarah said." "Exactly," Frank exclaimed. "It's a damn lie, Mike. I know the director of that center personally. Sarah left on her own terms with glowing recommendations. The incident Susan is twisting? Sarah stood up to a board member who was trying to cut funding for special needs programs and protect a staffer accused of neglecting a child. She fought for those kids, Mike. She chose to leave rather than compromise her principles. She's one of the most dedicated people I know. My own daughter. Sarah helped her through a really tough time after her mom and I divorced. She's a miracle worker, not a menace." The pieces slammed into place with sickening clarity. Susan's manipulations, his own prejudiced assumptions, Sarah's quiet dignity in the face of his accusations. He had been a fool, a blind, grieving fool. He had let his pain and his cop's suspicion, artfully stoked by Susan, destroy the one chance his daughter had for healing. The truth, unveiled in all its uncomfortable rawness, was a devastating indictment of his own judgment. The weight of Frank's revelation, combined with what he'd seen on the camera footage and read in Emily's journal, crushed Mike. He spent the rest of the night pacing, a maelstrom of guilt, shame, and a desperate, urgent need to make things right. He had wronged Sarah terribly. He had betrayed Lily's fragile trust. He had allowed his own brokenness to inflict more pain. By morning, a grim determination had settled over him. He knew what he had to do, however difficult, however humiliating it might be. First, he called Susan. His voice was cold, devoid of its usual gruffness. He told her, in no uncertain terms, that he knew what she had done, that her malicious gossip had caused irreparable harm, and that she was no longer welcome in his home or near his daughter until she could learn to behave with basic human decency. Susan, for once, was speechless, then sputtered a weak denial before Mike hung up, the severing of that toxic tie a small, bitter satisfaction. Then came the hardest part, finding Sarah. He didn't have her new address. He called Frank, who, after a moment of hesitation, and probably a lecture Mike deserved, gave him the number for the small independent bookstore where Sarah sometimes worked part-time. Mike drove there, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He found Sarah shelving books, her expression serene, though there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. When she saw him, her composure faltered for a split second, a flicker of surprise and perhaps apprehension, before her calm mask slipped back into place. "Lieutenant Donovan," she said, her voice polite but distant. "What can I do for you?" He deserved that coolness, he knew. He deserved much worse. "Sarah," he began, his own voice rough with emotion. Can we talk, please?" She led him to a small, quiet alcove at the back of the store. Mike didn't beat around the bush. He told her everything. About Susan's lies, about his own stupid, blind prejudice, about the sealed juvenile record that had preyed on his mind, which he now understood, from Frank, was a minor shoplifting charge when she was a desperate teenager, long since expunged and irrelevant. He told her about watching the tapes, about reading Emily's journal, about the barrette. He laid bare his mistakes, his shame, his profound regret. "I was wrong, Sarah," he said, the words a painful admission. "I was so incredibly, devastatingly wrong. I let my fear, my grief, my damn cop suspicion get the better of me. I judged you. I hurt you. And worst of all, I hurt Lily. I pushed away the one person who was actually reaching her." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But Lily needs you. I need you to help her. Please, Sarah. If there's any way. Will you come back?" Sarah listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the bookshelves. Mike held his breath, prepared for her refusal, for her anger. Twist number 10, minor but character-driven. Finally, Sarah looked at him, and he saw not anger, but a deep, weary sadness in her eyes. "Lieutenant," she said softly, "it wasn't just your suspicion, it was your lack of trust, not just in me, but in Lily, in her ability to connect, in her way of communicating." She paused. "I will come back for Lily, because she deserves every chance. But things have to be different." "Anything," Mike said, a wave of relief so intense it almost buckled his knees. "Anything you say." "No more cameras, Lieutenant," Sarah stated, her voice firm but gentle. "No more watching from the shadows. If I am to help Lily, you need to be a part of it. You need to learn to listen to her, and to trust me. We do this together, openly, or we don't do it at all." Mike met her gaze. Her condition was more than fair. It was a lifeline. It was a chance to not only help his daughter, but to perhaps begin healing himself. "Together," he agreed, the word a solemn vow. "No more cameras. I promise." The first step on a long, uncertain road to redemption had been taken. Sarah Johnson's return to the Donovan household was not an instant fix, no miraculous overnight transformation. The damage done by Mike's suspicion and her abrupt departure ran deep, especially for Lily. The little girl initially was even more withdrawn around Sarah, a wary, almost hurt look in her eyes that pained Mike to witness. It was a stark reminder of the trust he had broken not just with Sarah but with his own daughter. True to his word, Mike had the cameras removed. The house felt different without their silent, judging presence, emptier in some ways but also lighter, as if a heavy veil had been lifted. It was unnerving for him at first, this lack of constant surveillance. He had to consciously fight the urge to know what was happening in Lily's room every second. He had to learn to trust. Sarah, with unwavering patience, began the slow process of rebuilding. She didn't try to force Lily's affection or rush her recovery. She simply resumed her quiet, steady presence, re-establishing the safe, predictable environment Lily so desperately needed. She brought back the smooth stones, the soft fabrics, the gentle humming. She sat with Lily, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes whispering stories or observations about the world outside the window. Mike, following Sarah's lead and her explicit condition, began to actively participate. It was awkward at first. He was a cop, used to giving orders, to taking control. Sitting on the floor, trying to engage a non-responsive child with a textured ball or a picture book, felt foreign, almost unnatural. But Sarah guided him gently, teaching him to observe Lily's subtle cues, to listen not just with his ears but with his heart. "Don't focus on what she's not doing, Lieutenant," Sarah would say softly during their brief evening debriefs, after Lily was asleep. Focus on the tiny things she is doing, the way her breathing changes when you read a certain story, the way her fingers uncurl just a fraction when she hears a particular song. Those are her words, for now. Slowly, painstakingly, progress began. It started with Lily allowing Sarah to sit a little closer. Then, she might briefly meet Sarah's eyes. One afternoon, as Sarah was arranging the stones into a spiral pattern, Lily reached out and moved one of the stones, ever so slightly, incorporating it into the design. It was a monumental moment, a tiny act of shared creation. Mike, witnessing these moments firsthand, not through a camera lens, felt a profound shift within himself. He was learning a new language, the language of his daughter's silent world. He started to see the intelligence, the sensitivity, the unique beauty in Lily that her autism and trauma had obscured, but not extinguished. He learned to be present, truly present, without the need to fix or control. There were good days and bad days, days filled with small victories. Lily humming along with Sarah, Lily pointing to a picture in a book, Lily even allowing Mike to hold her hand for a few precious seconds. And there were days of regression, of meltdowns, of frustrating silence. But now, they faced them together, Mike and Sarah as a team, with Lily at the center. The joy, when it came, was all the more precious for the struggle. One evening, as Mike was reading a simple bedtime story, a ritual Sarah had encouraged him to start, Lily, who had been staring at the ceiling, turned her head and looked directly at him. Her lips moved, and a tiny, almost inaudible sound emerged. It wasn't a word, not yet. But it was a sound directed at him, an acknowledgement. Mike's heart swelled. It was more eloquent than any symphony. He learned about Sarah's lost son, Daniel, not through a journal, but through her quiet strength, through the almost sacred tenderness with which she cared for Lily. He understood that her gift wasn't some mystical power, but the profound empathy of a mother who had known an unfathomable loss and had channeled that love and pain into healing others. His respect for her grew boundless. The house, once filled with a suffocating silence, began to breathe again. It wasn't always loud, not always easy, but it was real. It was the sound of a family, however unconventional, rebuilding itself from the ashes of grief and misunderstanding. Months melted into a year. The transformation in Lily was remarkable. She wasn't cured. Autism wasn't something to be cured, Mike now understood, but a different way of being, of experiencing the world. But she was undeniably, beautifully, present. The fortress of silence had crumbled, replaced by a landscape of emerging words, tentative interactions, and a growing confidence. She still had her routines, her sensitivities, but now she could often communicate her needs, her anxieties, sometimes with a whispered word, sometimes with a gesture Sarah and Mike had learned to understand. She started attending a small, specialized school program, a step Mike would never have dreamed possible a year ago. The meltdowns were fewer, shorter, and often Sarah or even Mike could help her navigate through them with a newfound understanding. Mike himself was a changed man. The hard edges of the street cop had softened, revealing a patience and empathy he hadn't known he possessed. His relationship with Lily was no longer one of desperate helplessness, but of a deep, quiet connection. He learned to find joy in her unique way of seeing the world, in her small, hard-won victories. His work at the precinct also benefited. His colleagues noticed a new level of understanding in his dealings with victims and even suspects. Sarah Johnson remained an integral part of their lives. She was no longer just Lily's caregiver, she was family. She had her own small apartment now, but spent many afternoons and some weekends at the Donovan house, a steady, loving presence for both Lily and Mike. The three of them had forged a unique bond, a tapestry woven from shared grief, hard-earned trust, and a resilient love. There was no romantic undercurrent between Mike and Sarah, but a deep platonic affection and mutual respect that was, in its own way, just as profound. Final scene and gentle last twist, hopeful conclusion. One crisp autumn afternoon, they were at a local park. Lily, holding Mike's hand with one of hers and Sarah's with the other, was pointing at a flock of geese flying overhead. "Birds," she said, her voice still soft, but clear. "Go. Sky." Mike squeezed her hand, his heart full. "That's right, sweetie. Birds go in the sky." As they walked, they passed a playground. A group of children were laughing and shouting. A year ago, such a scene would have sent Lily into an immediate shutdown. Today, she paused, watching them with a curious, almost wistful expression. Then, to Mike and Sarah's astonishment, Lily gently tugged her hand free from Mike's. She took a few hesitant steps towards the edge of the playground, her eyes fixed on a little girl on a bright red swing. She didn't go all the way. She just stood there, watching, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a grand gesture. She didn't suddenly run off to join the other children, but it was a universe of progress. It was Lily on her own terms, beginning to contemplate rejoining the wider world. Susan, Mike's sister-in-law, had called a few weeks prior. Not to meddle, but to offer a tentative, somewhat awkward apology. She'd heard about Lily's remarkable progress, about Sarah's unwavering dedication. I might have been wrong about some things, Michael," she'd mumbled. Mike had accepted the apology, not for Susan's sake, but for his own, a final act of letting go of past bitterness. He knew true reconciliation would take time, if it ever came, but the door was no longer bolted shut. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Lily turned back to Mike and Sarah. She reached for their hands again. "Home?" she asked. "Yes, Lilybug," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's go home." He looked at Sarah over Lily's head, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The cameras were long gone, dismantled and stored away. He no longer needed to watch from the shadows to understand what was happening in his own home, in his own heart. He had learned to see, truly see, through the lens of trust and love. The silent peace in their lives hadn't been Lily's muteness or the unspoken grief. It had been the missing piece of connection, of understanding, of unwavering faith in one another. And now finally that piece had been found, creating a melody of family that was more beautiful, more resilient than any he could have ever imagined. The silence was still there sometimes, but it was no longer an enemy. It was just a quiet space where love could grow.